I'd like to talk to you about how the personal development industry can induce, teach and exploit what is known as learned helplessness. And in order to know what learned helplessness is, we're going to have to go back in time to the 60s, to a couple of psychologists called Seligman and Meyer, who did some experiments with dogs who were kept in isolated and trapped conditions. They had 3 sets of dogs, some which were not harnessed, some which were harnessed and had means to escape, and a third group of dogs, dog number 3, which is of most interest to us. Number 3 was kept in a compound, trapped and subjected to electric shocks on an infrequent basis. And what is interesting about dog number 3 is when dog number 3 was put in the conditions other than the trapped and painful ones, dog number 3 would roll over, lie down and refuse to leave the confines of his space, even though there was no electric shock being administered and he was free to leave. And this condition has since become known as learned helplessness. Well, what I'd like to explore is the idea that the personal development industry is in danger of inducing learned helplessness in people that subscribe to it. We've previously talked about the role of motivation and motivational speakers and how they can create dopamine spikes for a person, and how the person who is experiencing the dopamine spikes then becomes hooked on the spikes and the motivation rather than hooked on creating positive outcomes for themselves. They learn how to mistake the dopamine spike with the positive outcome and then become addicted to the positive outcomes they feel are happening. And it could be argued that having positive outcomes was never really the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise, from the point of view of the professional development industry, is to keep people tied up and addicted to feel-good factors, not to make their lives better. What do you think of that? Put your own comment below if you so desire. I think it's slightly controversial, but I think it's true all the same. And as I've stated previously, I don't think people have sat down with a drawing board and worked this out. However, there's many a motivational speaker out there who has managed to get rich and doesn't mind getting rich on the fact that some people are hopelessly addicted to personal development and motivation. But to return to the topic of the third dog and learned helplessness, the conditioning that happens when somebody learns to be helpless is both behavioral and neurological. The truth of the matter is that when somebody learns to be helpless, they are rewiring their brains in certain ways. And people who are hooked on dopamine spikes and hooked on the spikes that motivation creates can become trapped in a feedback loop. They can also be trapped in an escalating situation whereby they're going to need more and more, quotes, personal development and more motivation to feed the need for dopamine in their minds. This becomes a form of learned helplessness, because without the dopamine fix and without the guru and without the access to the personal development materials, they feel like they can't escape the compound. What they learn to do, in fact, is to customize their own emotional pain. Even on the subject of personal autonomy, one could argue that somebody who's hooked on the personal growth industry find themselves in a situation of imagined hope, followed by quick release and stimulus, followed by disappointment, followed by a vacuum. And the only way they can fill the vacuum is to engage again in imagined hope, also known as motivation. I'd argue that this is very similar to other addictive cycles, whereby the anticipation of the thing that causes pleasure, the exposure to the thing that causes pleasure, the depression that follows, and the vacuum that follows, is something that the personal development industry is very willing to exploit. Have you noticed their attachment to the so-called big ticket offer? The big ticket offer is one whereby somebody might be encouraged to take out a loan in order to feed the monkey on their back, to get bigger and bigger, more impressive and noteworthy motivation dopamine spikes. It's another way of experiencing learned helplessness, in which positive outcomes were never the aim of the exercise. What's happened is that perversely, the aim of the exercise is to keep the dopamine factory running. So far, I've suggested that the personal growth, personal development industry has managed to find multiple ways to encourage people to customize their own experience of pain. And of course, the more pain that a person can experience, the more vulnerable and more susceptible they are going to be to anyone who can offer a fix. And incidentally, the expectation of a fix, the dopamine spike that comes from that, the empty promise of motivation, is going to become the thing that they need, as opposed to the positive outcomes that are often promised, but often not delivered. So learned helplessness, by very definition, is learned. I'm not suggesting that it has been directly taught to people by the personal growth industry, but I would suggest that people who have learned to be helpless have gone through some very complex and interesting circumstances in order to become so hooked and addicted to false hope, false motivation. And of course, this ultimately leads to them parting with quite large amounts of cash in order to feed their need. And I know, perhaps I'm being unfair to people who are in the personal growth industry, but have you noticed there is a hierarchy of grievance backstory operating for many people? Many people seem to be only qualified to offer help and personal growth to their market if they have an astoundingly depressing backstory, often relating to poverty, addiction, loss, all sorts of circumstances which many people find very difficult to relate to. However, if you do find it possible to relate to some of these stories, then the probability is that you're going to be very vulnerable, susceptible, and open to the idea of buying their products. So I'd like to suggest that there's a heady cocktail of past trauma and past unanswered needs and perceived inadequacies, which many of the coaches can capitalize on and exploit. As well as that, they feel that they can qualify the products that they are marketing because they are walking the talk, or because they are providing something which has been won from hard experience. And again, I'm not going to dispute that this can be true in many cases, but let's look at the facts a little bit more forensically and examine the case, and you can come to your own conclusion about whether I am speaking truth to power, whether I'm being paranoid, or whether I'm just making stuff up. Let's consider the evidence. We have many a coach and many a guru who has an astounding backstory relating to loss, trauma, alcoholism, addiction, all of the very toxic attributes and sad circumstances that you can imagine. We have a willing market of people who are keen to escape from the shackles they feel they're in. And those shackles may have been forged by their own backgrounds and their own experiences, which relates to trauma and divorce, addiction, alcoholism, and such like. So what you have is people who are susceptible to a message from somebody they perceive as knowing how they feel. And so the personal growth coach sometimes can be born out of the ashes of these circumstances and be seen as a means of rescue and salvation. And if you have somebody who has not had a lot of exposure to developing the skills and the disciplines and the systems they need, now we're going to have a problem. And if you're working with people who haven't had the background, the education, the skills or knowledge or the breaks to be able to develop the techniques and the strategies and the systems that they require to get themselves out of the problems, they're going to be caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock being their perception of their own lives as being less than perfect. The hard place being having the ability to develop the skills to get out of their problems. And in between the rock and the hard place, it's very easy to sell motivation. It's very easy to sell dopamine fixes. It's very easy to sell false hope. And if a person exposes themselves to enough of this, then what's going to result is a form of learned helplessness. So that even if they find themselves in a better situation where their problems are not so great, they will find themselves trapped, unable to escape, unable to get away from the pain that they've inflicted on themselves and they've customized for themselves. Essentially, a person who is over invested in personal growth and dopamine fixes and fake motivation, essentially that person has become the third dog. So how do we extricate ourselves? How do we cease to be the third dog? How do we wean ourselves from the dopamine addiction and bad habit of relying on fake motivation? As I've said before, one way is to engage in disciplined, repetitive actions, compounding on a daily basis. Another way to release ourselves from the dopamine addiction and the motivation frenzy is to learn to be more disciplined, lower our expectations, and disconnect that small voice of entitlement that may be running in your background. So when I suggest you have a small voice of entitlement running in your background, it's not an accusation, it's not a moral judgment. But consider this: if you think that you can flick a switch and solve all your problems with one quick motivational fix, isn't that unrealistic? Isn't it a little bit entitled to believe that you deserve to have one quick fix, one thing that's going to solve all your problems? And even if it isn't entitled to believe that, isn't it strange that there are people out there who will exploit that desire within you? Is there something wrong with those people? Are they pulling the wool over your eyes? And are they exploiting the fact that you are lost, stuck between a rock and a hard place? I'll invite you to consider that. Going forward, I'd like to continue this series of discussions about the personal growth industry and see how we can achieve escape velocity from some of the traps. We now are living in a trust recession, and we live in a glut of information inflation. This means that it's never been easier to access fake hope or false motivation. Unfortunately, The way that media, consumerism, and algorithms are formed is to exploit our need for dopamine spikes. So if you find yourself on that hamster wheel, you're going to have to start asking yourself some serious questions. First of all, don't blame yourself for being on it, because to some extent it's not your fault. Secondly, realize you've got to draw a line somewhere between blaming society, community, consumerism and social media and starting to achieve autonomy and authority over your own future. So have a think about that. So do be aware that learned helplessness is being lost and in despair. And if you feel that you cannot escape your predicament, then you are in a situation of learned helplessness. But I'd like you to consider as well that sometimes those who come to your rescue are coming with plastic gifts. If and where somebody is offering you false hope and get it quick fix motivation and dopamine spikes, that person is selling you short. And the advantages to that person is that they're going to keep you coming back for more. So in short, if we were to look at a motive for the personal growth industry selling motivation and false hope, it is that it keeps the industry running. It keeps the customer coming back for more. In the same way that any other kind of industry that sells quick fix, feel good chemicals or substances always wants you to come back for more. So ask yourself this question. In your endeavors and in your personal growth, your journey, are you actually seeking positive outcomes, or are you on a hamster wheel running in circles, feeding the dopamine junkie inside you? And are the people that you're investing your hard-earned cash into exploiting this fact, either consciously or unconsciously? So I'm going to make my tracks now, fellow seeker. I would like to leave you with one final thought, if I may. As always, whatever it is you dare to do or dream, begin it now.